Continuing with chapter 4, I believe, where we left off. One of the really secret techniques of the secret team is to cellularize and play by ear the development of some scheme. It would be hard to say that they planned it that way because one of the things that the team understands and practices the least is planning. But as an operation develops, they assign one part of it to one group and another part to another group. At certain levels of the hierarchy, these come together. It would be nice if such things were done with PERT chart or network charting, precision and effectiveness, but they are not. It doesn't state what a PERT chart is. When the CIA needs something from the Navy, it will have a certain man call upon the Naval Focal Point Office and request the item. Depending upon how easy this detail is put over, the briefer may or may not tell the Navy what he plans to do with it. The Navy may press him and say, in effect, we cannot send you 2 Navy doctors on temporary duty to Panama for Project XYZ unless you tell us exactly what Project XYZ is and why you need 2 Navy doctors. The Navy knows that if the doctors were to be used on an Army post, this would not look right, even in Panama, and the Navy might be left holding the bag in the event the operation were to be compromised. At this point, the CIA man might tell the Navy the real story, or he might tell them the cover story, a lie, and see if he can get away with it. In either case, the focal point officer is doing his job. He will gain sufficient time to call upon the office of the Chief of Naval Operations to mention this request to the cleared executive officer there. At this point, the executive officer may or may not choose to inform the Chief of Naval Operations. In this rather hit-or-miss manner, the Chief of Naval Operations, in this case Admiral Burke, may or may not have gotten a thorough briefing on the whole Bay of Pigs operation, since no one else did it. Would be surprising if Admiral Burke did, furthermore, as he filled in for General Lemnitzer only from time to time. He could not possibly have ever received a full comprehensive Bay of Pigs briefing in this capacity as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is not to say that the Joint Chiefs of Staff may not have demanded and then have received a formal briefing. The Joint Chiefs of Staff did have a briefing of sorts during January 1961, just before Kennedy's inauguration. It was their one-time introduction to what the CIA was doing. But such briefings are themselves not comprehensive. They suffer first of all from limitation of briefing officers, who may not know all that is being done, and who, for their own parts, have not been told all that is underway. Therefore, even though someone as important as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff may insist upon a briefing in full, the very fact that he is so important will embolden the secret team to endeavor to give as little information as they are pressed to serve up, because they can be sure he has been too busy to become familiar with all prior activity. As a result, it would be surprising if Admiral Burke could have recognized a little more than 1/3 of what he heard during the committee meetings in those hectic days in the Pentagon of April and May 1961. Furthermore, Allen Dulles had other trump cards. No one on the committee and few people, if any, anywhere, really knew who all the responsible men were at the core of this operation. In his very excellent book, The Bay of Pigs, Haynes Johnson tells of his interviews with the Cubans to find out what they were asked at these meetings and what they had said at these meetings. But he found no one else with whom he could discuss the operation. He did not know whom to ask, and no one else would know the right ones either. Allen Dulles was not at all interested in bringing to the committee hearings the men responsible for the most familiar with operation. Wait a minute. I fucked that up. Allen Dulles was not at all interested in bringing to the committee hearings the men responsible for the most familiar with the operation. As a matter of fact, as far as he was concerned, that operation was over. It was a mess. It was not to be resurrected. He arranged these hearings so that Maxwell Taylor and Bobby Kennedy could hear as much as possible about the ways and means of the secret team, not in the past, but in the future. As a result, Allen Dulles marched an endless column of men in and out of the committee rooms who had either nothing or very little to do with the real Bay of Pigs operation. The most important thing was that a whole host of men who had a lot to do with the operation were completely ignored. Again, using the need-to-know principle, Dulles could do more by excluding knowledgeable men from the meetings than he could by parading platoons of men who knew only one phrase or another. Typical of the style of questioning that in which General Taylor discussed with certain Cubans the tactics they had used on the beach. This led to a wider discussion of Green Berets and paramilitary type tactics, and of the military role in civic action programs. Of all this away from the main subject, Mr. Dulles found in his patient hands some putty in the form of Bobby Kennedy and Maxwell Taylor. No one should underestimate the role played by Bobby Kennedy. Nothing in his strenuous career had prepared him to become a military strategist or battlefield tactician. But few men in this country were more experienced in the ways of government, and few men were tougher than Bobby Kennedy. He may have been won over by the Green Berets side because at that stage of development, their doctrine was uncluttered by later horrible events in Vietnam, and because this doctrine was an idealistic mix of Boy Scouts, military government, and Red Cross. But the evidence that Bobby Kennedy was not misled in his appraisal of the real problems underlying the serious and tragic failure of the Bay of Pigs operation. He came very close to seeing how terribly significant the real meaning of clandestine operations is, and how gross an impact the failure of such operations can have upon national prestige and credibility. It is entirely possible that had John Kennedy lived to serve until re-elected sometime during his administration, the genie of clandestine operations would have been put back in the bottle and the CIA might have been returned to its legally authorized role of an intelligence agency and no more. The committee hearings ended in May 1961. No report of these hearings has ever been published. It is possible that if it were to be published, it would be a most misleading document. It would contain all matter of irrelevant testimony, and it would be devoid of solid inside information. However, somewhere in the inner sanctum of the Kennedy White House, there were some very hard-hitting and valuable meetings concerning the future of clandestine operations by the United States government. These meetings must have been attended only by the Kennedy family team, not by the president's official staff. Out of these meetings came three most interesting and remarkable documents. Kennedy did not utilize the structured National Security Council he inherited from Eisenhower, yet from time to time he had to issue very important directives that affected the national security. Thus, he issued what were called National Security Action Memorandums, NSAM. By June 1961, some 50 or more such memoranda had been published, and the Department of Defense had established procedures for the processing and implementation of these major directives. Then, shortly after the Bay of Pigs Committee had completed its hearings, the White House issued three National Security Action Memorandum of a most unusual and revolutionary nature. They prescribed vastly limiting stipulations upon the conduct of clandestine operations. National Security Action Memorandum number 55 was addressed to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and its principal theme was to instruct the Chairman that the President of the United States held him responsible for all military-type operations in peacetime, as he would be responsible for them in time of war. Because of the semantic problems inherent in dealing with this subject, it is not always possible to be as precise in writing about clandestine operations as one might like it to be. But there was no misunderstanding the full intent and weight of this document. Peacetime operations, as used in that context, were always clandestine operations. The radical turn of this memorandum came from the fact that the President was charging the Chairman with this responsibility. It did not say that the Chairman should develop such operations. In fact, accompanying directives clarified that issue to mean that clandestine operations were to cease, or at least to be much restricted. What it did do was to charge the Chairman with providing the President with advice and counsel on any such developments. This National Security Action Memorandum therefore put into the Chairman's hands the authority to demand full and comprehensive briefings and an inside role during the development of any clandestine operation in which the United States government might become involved. The usual National Security Action Memorandum was signed by one of the senior members of the White House staff, and this changed from time to time depending upon the subject, the matter of the directive and addressee. National Security Action Memorandum number 55 was most singular in that it was addressed only to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with an information address notation for the Department of Counterintelligence, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense, and this order was signed personally by President John F. Kennedy. There was no doubt in the minds of any of the inner group of the Kennedy administration concerning the President's meaning and intentions. The fact that the Department of Counterintelligence received his copy as information was alone sufficient to heavily underscore the President's message. Coming as it did on the heels of the committee's intensive, thorough, inclusive, and somewhat misleading investigations, this document more than ever emphatically underlined the importance of the role of Bobby Kennedy. He may have been the passive member of the committee as he soaked up the action, but if nothing more came out of the hearings than this one directive, his presence on that committee would have been well worthwhile. It had become clear to Kennedy and to their inner family that the CIA lack of leadership in the Bay of Pigs had been the cause of its failure. The total lack of on-the-spot tactical leadership was the first element Kennedy attacked once the hearings had concluded. The document, more than anything else, sealed the fate of Dick Bissell and Allen Dulles. When the chips were down, they had not been there, nor had they made their presence felt. National Security Action Memorandum number 56 was not a significant document and was more intended to fill a small chink in the leaking dam than to reroute the whole stream of events. But what it lacked in thunder was more than made up in National Security Action Memorandum number 57. We have been saying much about clandestine operations and of the very peculiar nature of this type of business. When it has all been reviewed, one of the principal conclusions must be that the United States government is inherently and operationally incapable of developing and successfully carrying out clandestine operations, primarily because they run at total opposite to our basic way of life. Americanism means an open society, and clandestine operations are the desperate efforts of a closed society. Fletcher Knebel, in his excellent and very popular book, Vanished, has his principal character, President Raubush, say after a heated session with the Department of Counterintelligence, Arthur Ingram, "We've been over this ground before. He can't see that if we adopt communist methods in our zeal to contain them, we wind up defeating ourselves, war or no war. What is left of our open society if every man has to fear a secret government agent at his elbow? Who can respect us or believe us? We have no way of knowing whether or not Knenbel has Kennedy in mind as his fictional president. But if he had been a member of the inner Kennedy team at that time, he could not have come up with a more topical comment. Kennedy knew that he had been badly burned by the Bay of Pigs incident, and by June 1961, he and Bobby knew that he had been let down by the secret team. I carefully switched to the secret team label here because, in all fairness to the CIA, it was more than the CIA that really created the unfortunate operation. For example, the overeager blind participation of certain military elements gave the whole operation a weird and unbalanced character, which doomed it before it got off the ground. Then the lack of leadership, which really is the name of the game in clandestine operations, provided the coup de grace. It was the whole secret team that built a totally unexpected and totally unplanned operation out of the smaller, more nearly clandestine units that might have had some measure of success. Therefore, Kennedy did feel and did know that such clandestine operations had no place in the U.S. government. This led him to direct the publication of the most important of these three memoranda, National Security Action Memorandum number 57. NSAM number 57 was a long paper, as those things go, and we shall make no attempt to recall in great detail. When the Pentagon Papers series was published by the New York Times, it was noticeable for its omission. It is this sort of educated omission that makes the Pentagon Papers suspect in the eyes of those who have been most intimately connected with that type of work. Any gross batch of documents can be made to mean one thing or quite another, not only by what the news media publishes, but what they delete from the publication. National Security Action Memorandum number 57 is a controversial document that has not been released to date. The principle behind National Security Action Memorandum number 57 is absolutely fundamental to the whole concept of clandestine operations. It not only restates the idea that clandestine operations should be secret and deniable, but it goes beyond that to state that they should be small. It plays on the meaning of small in two areas of interest. First, unless they are very small, they should not be assigned to the CIA. And second, if they are not as small as possible, they have no chance of remaining secret and therefore have no chance by definition of being successful clandestine operations. This latter issue flies right in the face of the CIA, which had been working for years to define all sorts of operations, large and small, secret or not, as clandestine in order that they would then, by arbitrary definition, to be assigned to the CIA. This was an erosion of the principle, but it had been going on for so long, and the CIA had used the game so blatantly for so long that it had become almost a matter of course. The CIA managed to declare in 1962 that the training of the border police on the Indian-China border was a clandestine activity. Then, because it was clandestine, the whole job was assigned to the CIA. The CIA got itself deeply involved in the Katangese side of the Congo venture and defined its work as clandestine to keep it under agency control, whereas everyone in Africa and most of the world knew that the Katanzgi did not have the clout to operate huge C-97 four-engine Boeing transport aircraft, and all the other airlift that became immediately and mysteriously available to Shombe. It becomes ridiculous to equate activities in Indochina to any useful definition of clandestine. Yet the CIA continues to clamp high security classification on what it was doing there simply so that the agency could remain in control of the things it had stirred up. In Vietnam, this became so blatant and such a big business that the United States government had always had to retain an operational ambassador there. Not because an ambassador could add anything to the situation, and not that the government wished to depart so far from the historical administration in time of war, but because there have always been two equal commanding officers in Vietnam. There has always been the CIA commanding officer, and since 1964, there has always been an armed forces commanding officer. Those generals who served there before 1964 were simply figureheads, although some of them may not have fully realized that themselves, even to the end. The role of the ambassador has been to reference and arbitrate between the armed forces and the CIA. For anyone who may find this idea a bit new or rash, we would propose that he search for his precedent for the retention of a full and active ambassador in the battle zone in time of full war, and recall this is, by many counts, the second and most costly war in all our history, until Afghanistan and Iran and all that Middle East debacle. Thus, by the very size of its activities in so many areas, the CIA had exceeded all reasonable definitions of clandestine. This new Kennedy directive hit right at the most vulnerable point of the secret team at that time. No sooner had this directive been received in the Pentagon than heated arguments sprang up. Wherever this order was seen as to what was large and what was small in clandestine activities, oddly enough, the rather large and fast-growing contingent of the Department of Defense officials and personnel who had found a most promising and interesting niche in the special operations business were the loudest in support of small being large. In other words, they were much in support of more Bay of Pigs operations, and even by June 1961, there had been really significant moves of Bay of Pigs men and equipment from Latin America and the bases in the States to Vietnam. From them, it was onward and upward. What was a small Cuban failure or two, Indochina offered new horizons. There is no point in pursuing the argument further. It was never fully settled anyhow. Allen Dulles and his quietly skillful team had foreseen this possibility and had laid the groundwork to circumvent it. Opposing Dulles was like fighting your adversary on the brink of a cliff. He was willing to go over as long as he brought his opponent with him. He believed the handwriting on the wall, and he had sounded out the Kennedys. He knew that they had learned a lot from the Bay of Pigs, and he now knew where the Kennedys' Achilles tendon was, and he had hold on that vital spot. It would be worth a full chapter or perhaps a full book to be able to recount in detail what really happened to National Security Action Memorandum number 55 and 57. For the purposes of this account, we can discount National Security Action Memorandum number 56. I was responsible for the action on NSAM number 55, and for whatever use it might be to put. I was responsible for the action on NSAM number 55, and for whatever use it might be put to. Thus, its briefing to contain only selected senior officers can be accounted for. NSAM number 55 was briefed and in detail. It was a very short paper to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was red-striped as the Joint Chiefs of Staff terminology goes, meaning that it was read and noted by the Chiefs of Staff. While General Lemnitzer was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and while John F. Kennedy was president, NSAM number 55 provided a strong safeguard against such things as the Bay of Pigs. If Lemnitzer was going to be responsible to the president for operations in peacetime in the same manner as wartime, the best way to fulfill that responsibility in the eyes of General Lemnitzer would be to have no peacetime operations. Then President Kennedy made a most significant move, one perhaps that has had more impact upon the events during the past 10 years than any other that can be attributed to him or his successors. He denied to transfer General Lemnitzer to Paris to replace General Lauris Norstad as Allied commander of NATO troops. Lemnitzer was eminently qualified for this task, and it was a good assignment. To replace Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Kennedy moved Maxwell Taylor from the White House to the Pentagon. By that time, the Kennedys had espoused the new doctrine of counterinsurgency and had become thoroughly wrapped up in the activities of the Special Group Counterinsurgency. As the new clandestine operations group was called, although it had not totally replaced the old Special Group 5412 in scope and function as the authorizing body up for all clandestine affairs. It had created quite a niche for itself in the new counterinsurgency game. It used to be that anti-communist activity was carried out against communist countries, governments, and territory. There had been a gradual drift away from that. The new counterinsurgency philosophy and doctrine meant that anti-communism would now be waged in non-communist countries. Shortly after the Bay of Pigs investigation, Secretary of Defense McNamara, in conjunction with General Earl Wheeler, who at that time was the director of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, agreed to establish in the Joint Staff an Office of the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities. This office, among others, worked directly with the CIA and the White House. The incumbent Marine Major General Victor H. Krulak became the most important and most dominant man on the staff. He carried more weight with the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, than any other general, and was always welcomed by the White House, where he frequently and most eloquently preached the new doctrine of counterinsurgency. This created an ideal platform for General Taylor. He was by that time the chief proponent of counterinsurgency, the Army's Green Berets, and the CIA, and a most fortuitous assignment for the CIA and the secret team. He became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all of the pieces fell into place. With McGeorge Bundy in Taylor's old job in the White House, responsible for all clandestine activity, with Bill Bundy as the principal conduit from the CIA to McNamara later in state, and with Taylor on top of the military establishment. The secret team had emerged from its nadir on the beaches of Cuba and was ready for whatever might develop in Vietnam. And to further assure the success, Kennedy's own strict directive, NSAM number 55, was now in the hands of the very man who would want to use it the most and who would have the most reason to use it, Maxwell Taylor. In the hands of Lemnitzer, National Security Action Memorandum number 55 meant no more clandestine operations, or at least no more unless there were more compelling reasons. In the hands of Maxwell Taylor, this meant that he was most willing to take full advantage of the situation and to be the president's key advisor during peacetime operations, as he would be during times of war. One further factor played into this situation. It is quite apparent that Kennedy did not fully realize the situation he had unintentionally created. To him and to his brother, Maxwell Taylor was the model of the down-to-earth soldier. He looked like Lemnitzer, like Brady, even more like Patton, only better. He was their man. They did not realize that even in his recent book, The Uncertain Trumpet, he had turned his back on the conventional military doctrine and had become a leader in the new military force of response, of reaction, and of undercover activity. All summed up in the newly coined word counterinsurgency. Kennedy was not getting an old soldier in the Pentagon. He was getting one of the new breed. Taylor's tenure would mark the end of the day of the old soldier and the beginning of the Special Forces, the peacetime operator, the responsive, motivated counterinsurgency warrior who had been so abundantly uncovered in the conflict of the past 10 years in Vietnam. This was the climax of a long bit of maneuvering within the government by the secret team and its supporters. To accomplish their ends, they did not have to shoot down the Kennedy directives. National Security Action Memorandum number 55 and 57, in flames like the Red Baron, they simply took these memoranda over for their own needs and ignored them when they were in conflict with it. Wait a minute. National Security Action Memorandum number 55 and 57 in flames like the Red Baron. They simply took these memoranda over for their own ends and ignored them when they were in conflict with whatever it was they wanted. They buried any opposition in security and need-to-know and in highly classified eyes-only rules. Then with all the top positions covered, they were in charge. They were ready to move out to wherever secret intelligence input would find a soft or intriguing spot. Historians would be amazed when and if there are ever able to find some of those basic papers. They will discover that the access lists, meaning the cover lists of all those who have read the documents, and which are so closely guarded, will on some of these most important papers list only a few people, most of whom were no more than the clerks who processed the classified inventories. So very few people have ever seen the real documents, and few people have acted on them. More real control can be put on the government from the inside by not doing and not permitting to be done. Wait a minute. More real control can be put on the government from the inside by not doing and not permitting to be done those things which had been instructed and directed to be done than by other more conventional means. One of the best examples of this is what happened to the most important document, NSAM number 55. Nowhere else was Kennedy's strong desire for control more in evidence than in that paper and the ones that followed it, like National Security Action Memorandum 57. Thus it was that events marched relentlessly on toward Vietnam. The only ones who stood in the way were the president and his closest inmates, and they had been nearly outmaneuvered. Bit of a mighty chapter today. We will do chapter 5, a defense. Wait a minute. Chapter 5, defense as a national military philosophy. The national prey on intelligence. I am just butchering stuff today. God damn. Defense as a national military philosophy. The natural prey of the intelligence. My God, I gotta stop today. We will do this tomorrow. My God.